So this is going to be on collecting, curating, and the purpose of the museum. So as I see it, the ideal or the intersection of those three principles, collecting, curating, and the museum as a function, is the restoration of forgotten or underground or denied history. So I see the museum as an institution as really at its best a grassroots organization or even an individual pursuit, as in the creation of a museum, as a way to restore through the function of an artifact which remembers the historical truth, the full body of the historical truth. So we know today museums as institutions with hegemonic imperatives. And what I mean by a hegemonic imperative is that it has a certain uh, ideological or hierarchical method. It's a way of sorting through history to prioritize certain elements, moments, forces, factors, and parties and groups of individuals or political phenomenon or historical events. The real function of a a museum of truth or a museum of the scholarship of history of truth, so to speak, is to restore out from under these hegemonic narrative constructs of meaning, right? So it's to leave or remove from the institutional imperative, which is always either and or donor backed or public, as in governmental, right? Whether that's federal or state or whatever sort of governmental entity backed um, pursuit of a collection which is attempting to explain or document a historical moment or a series of historical moments. So what I have here is it's actually a reproduction later on in the 20th century, probably in 1950, of a photograph of the Harrisburg Giants from the early 1900s. Um, we talked a little bit about spot polls already, and the function of an artifact like this is not even so much that it is a historical object proper, but rather that it restores a historical moment. They're standing in front of what looks like a house in a very casual posing in an outdoor environment. We're looking at the restoration of the entire historical body, right? So this is a project of the memory of the past or the recollection of the dead. And in order to thoroughly and fundamentally do so, there needs to be a counter narrative or an expulsion of the hegemonic constructs of the museum, right? Both in terms of the priority of the historical object as well as the priority of certain historical narratives, which function as dominant cultural and ideological narratives, to bring about the fullness of the body of the history through the disjected, through the abjected, and through the shadow of whichever sort of civilizational or historical cultural construct is being created in that moment in time. So the museum is the functionary. It's the propagation of the ideological and cultural perspective that is dominant in the time. So it's the spirit of the age, so to speak, represented in the historical materialism of the objects that are collected, curated, and then the narrative or the expression or the idea that is being um, summoned through them, right? So this is a way of speaking a nation or a civilization's past back to and through itself in the way that it imagines itself to be, right? So whenever there is an institutional narrative, especially in terms of a museum, because it's very easy to visualize the institutional narrative through the museum because it is made manifest in material objects, right? The museum is a sort of theater of the accumulation of history, which itself is telling itself a story and then projecting that out into the public eye. The Smithsonian is a great example of this, right? And so the Smithsonian is always a contested ideological grounds because the Smithsonian itself is an arbiter and a propagator of stories, which stories are being told, which stories are not being told, and why, and what it means to the nation proper, the Smithsonian as a specifically American institution. Housed, funded, donor-sponsored, publicly backed American institution. So when you have something like that, there's always an underground of it. And what I mean by an underground is a sort of ritual inversion of its meaning-making constructs. And that in itself is always already in reality the rich, dormant, subconscious soil of any sort of national or civilizational construct. It is the abjected, it is the refused, it is the beneath, the made underclass. So in that way, a civilization is always already creating the death of history by way of exclusion, and that exclusion is a failure to include and encapsulate the full richness of the body of history. And of course, that's a project that's always in construction, because history is always accumulating the charnel house of its existence, right? These objects, these historical memories, these images are always already being lost. And so then there's this process of perennial restoration, which is restoring the body of the past dead into the present day context, which is a remembering, which then, of course, informs us moving into the future, because we have a better knowledge, a better idea, a fuller picture of the truth of the reality of where we came from and where we're going, right? So this is crucial archival work. So when we look at something like this, a 1950s reproduction of a 1906 to 1910s image of a historical black baseball team, the Harrisburg Giants, including this player member Spot Poles, who actually is from a town not too far from where I currently am, in Winchester, Virginia. What we're doing here is we're pulling this image. This is actually a pretty rarely seen image of the Harrisburg Giants. This image, which was reproduced from the original negative around sometime in the 1950s, we're pulling this image back and we're recovering it. And it doesn't necessarily even matter if it is a print from the original negative immediately, right? As in, it was printed in 1910, as opposed to printed again in 1950. It perhaps even matters more that it was printed in 1950 because of the recovery effort of the historical memory and political consciousness of that time itself. So you think about 1950, 1960 as the revolutionary linchpin and the turning point in the American political consciousness as it pertains to race, racial constructs, exclusion, Jim Crow era segregation, and the massive political and ontological shift of the American identity through that aperture of revolutionary consciousness. This image is being summoned back. It's being brought back, summoned back through the original negative into that moment, into a new print context, to remember this historical moment as a moment of American black barnstorming, pre-Negro Leagues moment of independent grassroots organization of black American baseball teams. So this is a perennial process of recovery. It's like a cyclical engine that moves through history and moves through time, where we are always already attempting to recover the disjected, the de-narrativized history which has been otherwise excluded or removed from the collective consciousness. And so this is the real imperative of any historical, cultural, political project of ontological recovery of being. So ontological recovery of being is that there are already these narratives that have been propagated. There are already these narratives that have been restored. These are the dominant cultural or political stories of a civilizational identity. And that identity construct is always circulating as a popular mass context or construct or consciousness. So what you're really doing then in this recovery project, both through the image that is printed again in the future, as well as a that's a good one, of that image primarily, in just the fact that it exists again, it returns to exist again, and thus is recovered through this archival construct, which we talked about this in terms of Bohemia magazine and the return of halftones and prints that were made in the 30s and 40s as Cuba was reconfiguring its national identity and remembering this historical baseball past of its origins. These were prints that were made 50 years into the future, which were recoveries of the original artifact, sometimes even photographs of the original artifact as it was decaying and was being lost to time actively. Right? So this is a national consciousness remembering itself, a political consciousness remembering itself, and thus restoring the agency of the past. And the agency of the past being the recovery of the image so we can commune with it actively. So you have artifacts that are this function and are with this function. The fact that they remain, or that they are lost, or that they are disremembered from the larger political body, when you have a truly active, it's usually independent, usually grassroots, even in terms of like a single functionary who's performing this work. This is it's beneath the museum. So it's like an excavation of the museum, an excavation of the existing narrative propagations of the museum into a true political archaeology of history. There is always, again, right, to refer to that base idea that I laid out, there's the museum, which is the light of day of historical and political consciousness. It's the dominant cultural narratives. You could call the museum popular consciousness proper. And then there's what's beneath the museum, which is the historical darkness, or the unconsciousness of a population which has been disjected and forgotten and even refused in a violent way, right? So these are the things that are actually deeply imperative to recover and restore to the light of day. So this is it's an exhuming, a political exhuming of the dead. There's such a high importance to that, and you can see that there's these different, especially magazines or independent local libraries that are performing this work. It usually actually is libraries or smaller local institutions, such as like the Cleveland Historical Society, that is reprinting these artifacts from the original negatives in various different points in time in history. So when you look at that, again, this is a much smaller, more regionally active recovery of a local history. And that local history, I think, in many ways can actually afford to be more inclusive because we're covering much less ground. It's such a specificity. So when I focus, for instance, on early modern baseball, specifically in the Western Hemisphere, between the periods of time of roughly 1860 to the late 1930s, right? Even if I expand that timeline, as I just did, my normal focus is early 1900 to like 1916. Even if I expand that timeline, I'm still working within a very narrow aperture, which allows me to move much closer to the interconnected humanity, right? To look at that local network where images and figures and contexts appear again and again in relationship to each other within that very narrow aperture, a sort of genre or theme, a basic theorem of history. And to just zoom in on that particular moment allows you to exhume a great deal. So when you're spinning the web of a civilizational or cultural narrative that spans hundreds, if not thousands of years, and involves a wide context and a wide berth of different cultural phenomena that are happening at the same time, as such is often the task of museums, you lose the thread of humanity by widening the aperture in an attempt to tell a story. The lens or the network becomes too wide, and you risk falling into deep abstraction, and worse, perhaps, you risk falling into a narrative political theology, which is an ideological construct, a belief system of how history functions. When you focus, again, we talked about this in one of the previous essays, when you focus on a specific moment in time, in terms of just maybe the span of a couple of decades, even in a hemispheric context in relationship to one cultural phenomenon, the root system appears much more clear or more clearly in that narrow framework. And through that root system, you're actually grasping more macrocosmic social and cultural phenomenon in that moment, through the aperture of one specific cultural phenomenon, such as baseball. So when we look at modernity in terms of the massive outgrowth of globalization, industrialization, etc., it's it's tempting to attempt to approach that from a wide span abstract perspective and try to understand it globally first. My argument would be this is something that you actually want to understand at the deepest, most contextual local level and see how the root network spins out through a specific cultural or social or political phenomenon where you can find other examples of it littered across different regional moments and movements. So it's like the connection of a synapse or a neuron. The neuron is looking locally and immediately to establish a connection. And we're using that same microbiotic context in a historical and cultural sense to establish real grounding and real narrative. So this real historical cultural project of the exhuming of history, which again is usually done so locally in terms of it's usually just one person. I was thinking a little bit about Walter Benjamin when I was doing this in terms of his theory and his work on collecting is that when we are recovering and exhuming history, what we really are doing is we're informing our humanity. We're informing our humanity through the recovery of something that was otherwise lost to time. And thus, in exhuming it and bringing it to light, we are remembering it. And in remembering it, we are restoring it to our narrative consciousness. And so that creates a wider aperture, incrementally wider aperture of our understanding of where we came from and where we're going, and the ontology of what it is to be human or what it is to be a being proper in a larger cosmological sense. So myself, I'm always looking for the deepest, most forgotten, most unexhumed, the darkest part of history to bring it to light, and then thus to say, this is a part of this whole here. This is a part of the whole picture. And so there's, even in a psychological sense, what we're talking about is the personal subconscious, the collective subconscious, and then even maybe a galactic subconscious of the psyche, which is the forgotten element of history. Let's say even in an evolutionary sense, the furthest, darkest moment in the oceans, so to speak, from a human biological transference of information over time. You're looking at a genetic ladder or thread or a linguistic that's being woven across space-time. And then what you're doing is you're going back into that and communing with it. You're seeking out the real historical experience of that moment and communing with it in a way that is deeply empathetic and compassion, and bringing that, exhuming that back into the light of day and saying this moment then is also this moment now, in the sense that history itself is never forgotten. It's just rather incorporated into the increasingly complex and compound body of the present. Again, this goes back to what we discussed in terms of chemicals, elements, and the fusionary process of stars. This is a metabolism of history that through the ashes that are exhumed and digested and born again into the present moment, we're working with the same information, biologically, genetically, and chemically that we were working with hundreds of thousands, even millions of years ago. But it's an information that is changing form over time. The aperture and the lens is shifting. We're experiencing these same compounds, but in new admixtures. So to recover these historical moments then is to restore the historical body of time proper into something that ever more closely resembles the truth of the infinite, right? So that time itself is a fragmentation, and what is lost to time is never truly lost. It's just lost to memory. So this is something that is a change of perspective, and that to reincorporate the exhumed body of the dead or the disjected is rather to restore the wholeness of history and present a real image, perspective, and essence of the truth of the wholeness of being to the present. And so much of this does come back to images. It comes back to materials. It comes back to artifacts and objects, because this is a way of communing back. It's a way of experiencing back in a literal sense, in a physical sense, in a sensorial sense, as opposed to just an abstract theorem or a remembrance that occurs specifically in a imaginal sense. So we could understand factually a part of history, but without being faced with it, whether that's through an image or an object or an artifact, it becomes very difficult to actually understand the ontological weight in the body and the history of time. And this is what we discussed in that the essence of time through Cuban photography, is that through the image itself, through the creation, the production, and even the reproduction of the image as a way of historical memory and preservation by archives and magazines and small independent museums, or even historians themselves, right, who are reproducing from these negatives to regenerate and rebirth the image. Um, Through that process, we are given and renewed the body of history and time, where otherwise it would be lost, right? So even when there is a flattening in terms of an image sense, the creation and production of an image as a light compound or emulsion on photographic paper, even when there is that reproduction, which is a flattening of the three-dimensional space-time reality of these figures that are organized in this place, in this time, in front of this house, etc. Even when there is a flattening of that context, and even a loss of the context in terms of which house there is, maybe there's a certain person that it's very hard to remember the identity of in terms of a name or a historical background or a biography. Even when that happens, there still is the remains and the remnants, and through that remnants, there is the possibility of exumption, the force of exumption, which would then allow for the force of historical redemption, if that makes sense, right? So to be able to exhume is to be able to redeem history through the remembrance of the object, however corroded or transformed or transfigured by time or reproduced by necessity, to maintain or remain one last or two last living examples of whatever artifact. That possibility then, in the deepest sense, is the possibility of the redemption of history through the remembrance of the moment that was otherwise disjected or lost to time. And that is the true responsibility of curation, collection, and the museum. So that'll do it. Thanks for listening. Catch you on the next one.